Welcome to Mindful Life. My name's Jill Higgins, and in this episode, I'm talking to Sharon Salzberg, one of my all-time favourite mindfulness teachers and authors. Sharon has a no-nonsense, practical, and relatable style of explaining mindfulness. She's a pioneer in the field of meditation, a world-renowned teacher, and the New York Times best-selling author of Real Happiness and other books. She's played a pivotal role in bringing meditation and mindfulness into mainstream American culture since the 1970s, including co-founding the Insight Meditation Society with Jack Cornfield and Joseph Goldstein in 1975. I caught up with Sharon in Barre, Massachusetts to talk about mindfulness, her 13th book, Finding Your Way, how she came to the practice, what motivates her, and to hear some of her personal reflections on her mindfulness journey so far. Sharon, thank you so much for taking the time out today to join me on Mindful Life.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
I wonder if you could start by perhaps setting the scene for us and telling me where in the world you are at the moment and what have you got on your desk.
I am in my house in Barre, Massachusetts. I'm next door through the woods from the Insight Meditation Society, which is the retreat center I co founded in 1976. And my desk is, well, I've got lights, I've got water, I have tissues, I have tax forms because it's getting to be tax season here in the US. And I've got receipts. I got a good reminder now to clean my desk.
It sounds a little bit like my desk. As a teacher and an author, how do you explain the concept of mindfulness to those who are new to the practice?
Well, mindfulness can mean many different things, which makes it a little complicated. I tend to describe mindfulness as a quality of awareness so that our perception of what's happening in the present moment is not so distorted by old habits or by bias or by assumptions. And so all those things may arise, but we can see them for what they are and maybe return to the original experience we were having unfiltered by all of those things.
I think that people often come to mindfulness out of sheer need. So, from my perspective as a lawyer and as a mother, I came to mindfulness needing to find a way to stop cross examining my family members and friends, to get a break, to be able to have a semblance of calm, and to get that clearer vision, if you like, towards my own negative thoughts so that they didn't start to overwhelm me. So I'm always curious about how people start this journey and what brings them to mindfulness. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about your background and how you came to the practice.
I went to college when I was 16 years old. And when I was a sophomore, my second year, I took an Asian philosophy course because there was a philosophy requirement. And honestly, looking back, I think it was kind of happenstance. I looked at the schedule. I thought, oh, that class is on Tuesday. That's convenient. I'll do that one. And the course totally changed my life. I'd had a very traumatic, chaotic childhood. And like for many people, this was never spoken about in my family. And so I didn't know what to do with all those feelings within me, although I knew I was quite unhappy. And it was in the context of that class that I heard that there were practices, there were methods, there were techniques called meditation. And if you did them, you could be a lot happier. And I was going to college in this city called Buffalo, New York. I looked around Buffalo. I did not see it anywhere. This was a long time ago. So I created an independent study project and presented it to the school. I said, I want to go to India for a year and study meditation, learn meditation. And they said, okay. So I left in 1970. I spent a little bit longer than my allotted year, but I did come back. I went and finished school, went back to India, and finally came back in 1974. And at that point, one of my own teachers had told me to teach. And so I came back as a teacher. And it was not unusual to be at a party or some social situation, and somebody would say, "What do you do?" And I'd say, "I teach meditation." And they would kind of go, "Oh, that's weird." It was very, very different in those days. It took some time for people to understand more clearly that these practices were not necessarily tied to a belief system. We've seen quite a change through these years.
Absolutely. When I reflect on my own practice and the benefits that I think it brings for me, I know that when I practice and I'm able to maintain regularity, I feel a lot more compassionate towards myself. I am more self aware about the role I am taking in conflict. And also, the important thing I think about is how to repair when situations go wrong and how much more quickly we can gather ourselves and take ourselves away from that situation of either shame or blame. I wonder about what benefits you think your practice reaps for you. How do you perceive those benefits in a really practical sense?
I think often of the stress dynamic. There's the pressure or circumstance or incident that's happening. And then there's the resource with which it's met. And that resource may come from being able to access some inner strengths, like centering or getting some perspective, being able to let go and begin again, kind of a resilience. That sense of resource may come from not feeling so alone, feeling connected to a larger community in what we're facing. And we know the practicalities of this just from everyday life, right? Like if you didn't sleep last night and you're exhausted and you go to work, you overhear this comment and you take it so to heart and you're very upset, in contrast to you had a beautiful night's sleep and breakfast with loving friends or family, and you go off to work and you hear the comment and you think, wow, that person's having a hard day. So sometimes people hear this and they think, well, that kind of encouragement means we're never going to try to do anything to change our circumstance, to make things better, to challenge unfairness or something like that. But that's not true. I always think, why try to make that effort from maximum exhaustion and depletion and feeling like you have nothing within, in contrast to having that sense of developing some inner strength. So, in a very real way, I think that's been the story of my life. It's very hard for me to talk about the benefits because it's been most of my life at this point that I've been practicing meditation. And I can't imagine not having that capacity to return to and keep strengthening.
I often call it a refilling of my own personal tank. That idea of putting the mask on your own face on an airplane to make sure your own oxygen levels are good before you start to help anyone else. I often refer when I teach to your no nonsense approach, which I adore. For me, your style is really encouraging. And I wonder, aside from the meditation, do you have a favorite daily mindfulness practice? So one of those informal dropping into your senses practice that just brings you a little comfort during the day.
I love those. They're a lot of fun. One of the things that I've always liked about those kind of practices is that they're actually very private. You can be in a room full of people and feeling your breath, and nobody knows you're doing it. On Zoom, for example, or some electronic medium, when I see people's faces in little boxes, I often do a loving kindness meditation, thinking silently, may you be happy, may you be peaceful. That would be one. And then I try to do something each day that is not multitasking, drinking a cup of tea or something like that for once, not drinking the tea while checking my email, while on Zoom, while, doing five other things, but just like really feeling the warmth of the teacup and smelling the tea and tasting the tea and so on.
Tea is a really good one. I have mine here, but of course I'm not going to multitask while I'm asking you questions. But I'm I'm totally with you. Another favorite one of a colleague of mine is using the hand cream on her desk. So she'll keep a little pot of hand cream and she'll just have a moment where she just actually gives a little bit of care to her hands and does nothing else. And this idea of moving away from multitasking, I think, is a really important one because we get so charged and frayed and het up by the enormity and the number of tasks ahead. What advice would you give to somebody who's interested in the word and the concept of mindfulness to begin? How would you encourage them to give it a go?
Well, we know we can make a distinction between a formal or dedicated practice and these informal things like drinking the cup of tea or using the hand cream is a wonderful idea. I think I'll take that up. I even have room on my desk, I think. I'm very much in favor of formal practice as well. It doesn't have to be that long. I have a friend, Amishi Jha, who's a neuroscientist at University of Miami in Florida, who studies mindfulness in high stress professions like the military, high performance athletes, first responders like firefighters, and so on. And what she says her lab has found is that 12 minutes a day, 3 to 5 times a week will actually change your life for the better. So that's not very much. For me, 3 to 5 times a week will not really work because it'll be Monday and I'll think, I'll start on Wednesday. And then it'll be Wednesday and I'll think, I'll do it 3 times on Saturday and I'll never do it. Every day is actually easier for me. So some short commitment every day or 3 to 5 times a week if it works for you, where you maybe are sitting or you could be lying down, you could be walking, but it's a dedicated period where your only goal is to deepen awareness and compassion, those qualities that come from meditation. And that will also be the springboard I found for remembering when I'm drinking that cup of tea, like, okay, let me just pause all these other activities for a moment and fully experience this.
I always say sitting down to or lying down to meditate, it's a bit like yoga when the yoga teacher says the hardest part is getting yourself onto the mat. Once you've done that, it's all fine. It's interesting to consider what motivates us to practice. And I wonder what it is that motivates you to find that time.
Well, it's been, more than 50 years. It's been different things at different times. I will say, small as 12 minutes may seem, it's actually difficult often to do it. And part of it is sometimes we just feel guilty. I can't take the time. It's too selfish. Like I have too much to do. Other people need me, whatever it might be. And also, especially earlier in my practice, it was a lot of self judgment. If I sat and things felt peaceful and nice, I think this is wonderful. I'm going to live in India for the rest of my life, feeling just like this. And when my head hurt or my knee hurt or I was restless or I was bored, I think it doesn't work. I can't do it. And so learning how not to be constantly judging and assessing and evaluating was also very important. I think it's important to evaluate, but not every moment. And also, when we try to assess if it's worth continuing something like meditation, we have to look not at the, say, 12 or 20 minutes a day we're actually practicing. We have to look at our life. How do I speak to myself when I make a mistake? How am I meeting a stranger? How am I in a contentious situation? How much patience, how much resilience, how much ability to listen is coming forth in me?
I took your brilliant book, You're Finding Your Way, on holiday with me last week. So it went to Spain. In one part of the book, you say that even after 50 years of meditating, you found that troublesome emotional issues don't just disappear, but rather that you have an opportunity to relate differently to everything that you're going through. And you then say, I've seen that we have to allow the dignity of every feeling without blaming ourselves or trying to push anything away. And I wonder whether meditation has that ability to help us in this way, no matter how difficult the emotion.
I think that's very true and not something people necessarily believe. And so I think it's a message that needs to be reinforced again and again. Our goal in meditation is not to wipe out thinking, for example, to make all thoughts go away. It's not to wipe out more difficult or painful feeling because it's not going to work. But we can be very different with everything that arises, much more present, much more balanced, much kinder. For example, not adding a whole lot of stuff like, this is all that I'll ever feel, or I'm the only one who ever feels this. And it's a different experience altogether, even though some of the same things may still be arising. And so it's really important because that's so freeing to understand.
I spoke to a colleague of mine this morning and I mentioned that I was going to chat with you, and she said to me, "Oh, the goddess of loving
Well,
kindness."
that's rather nice. Thank you.
Now, for those who aren't familiar with the notion of loving kindness, could you just put it into a few words or phrases? Because I think the concept is wonderful and I think it's incredibly powerful beyond what we might imagine.
Well, there's loving kindness as a quality and there's loving kindness as a meditation practice. It is its own distinct methodology, very closely aligned with mindfulness. And as a quality, it's really about connection, it's about inclusion, connecting to ourselves in a much deeper way, having a sense of connection to all others, which doesn't mean liking somebody or thinking, I'm going to spend every evening with them or any evening with them. It's not about behavior per se. It's about a heart space of recognizing what's actually true, which is that we live in an interdependent universe, and that concept of self and other and us and them, while useful in some contexts, is not like an absolute truth. It's this bone deep recognition of that kind of interconnection. And it happens through wisdom, it happens through insight, it happens through seeing more clearly. And it also happens, I have seen over and over again, through actually these practices which are dedicated to deepening that quality. And one of my favorite things to bring up if I'm brought into a company or an organization to teach is the question, how many other people need to be doing their job well for you to do your job well? Because we are counting on unseen people. And if that doesn't make any sense, I then ask, well, do you commute to work? If so, do you ever think about that train engineer or auto mechanic? There's the fundamental question, did you eat anything today? And if you don't grow all your own food, just spend a moment to recognize the many beings who are contributing to the fact that that plate of broccoli is sitting on your kitchen table. We do live in a world that is actually based on interconnection.
Absolutely. Now, Sharon, at this point in my interview, I always like to ask guests whether they have a favorite go to book at the moment, something that you are loving or you think just really speaks to you in some special way. Have you had a moment to consider this, Sharon?
I'm asked often about early books in my meditation and if any of them are still relevant to me. And so I was hearing your question in that light. And one of the very early books I came upon was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Suzuki Roshi. And I would say it's still relevant to me. It's very simple. And it keeps reminding me when I pick it up that one's path of practice, as Suzuki Roshi would put it, is basically to express one's Buddha nature, not to somehow attain what's not there, but to reach back to those deepest parts of oneself and bring them out in everyday life, conversations and family and so on.
And similarly, do you have a piece of music that reminds you of a particular aspect or stage in your mindfulness journey?
Okay, so this is my story. I was working on what was my 10th book, which was called Real Love, and I was late with it and discouraged. I had hit some roadblocks in being able to write, and I'm being very frank now. I just had the thought, you know what? Nobody cares what you have to say anymore. It's your 10th book. Just turn it in. And it was just then that a friend of mine was coming through New York City, And he said, "Can I get you tickets to any kind of show?" And I just said, "How about Hamilton? I'd like to go see Hamilton." Not knowing at the time that it was really difficult thing to get tickets to. Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote it, was still starring as Alexander Hamilton, but he got tickets. And I was sitting there, and because Lin-Manuel Miranda was still in it, I couldn't take my eyes off of him. And I thought, you wrote this. Like everything I'm seeing came out of your brain. And I just thought, you can never just turn something in. Every single thing you do, which of course is one of the lessons of mindfulness, you have to do fully, completely with your entire being, no part left out. So my friend still teases me. He says, I turned to you at the end and I said, "Do you want to go out to dinner?" And you said, "I have to go home and write." And so ever since, Hamilton has been my go-to piece of music.
Brilliant. I want to just ask you about poetry. So, for me, the poem The Guest House, every single time I read it, it says something new and it reminds me of the importance of welcoming all the difficult emotions. And I'm curious about whether you have a poem or a quote that does something similar for you.
Probably my favorite poem is Kindness by Naomi Shihab Nye. And the famous line within it is, in order to know the deepest thing inside, you must also know sorrow. So that very directly is in relevance to your question. In order to know kindness, you need to know sorrow and be able to open to one another. But if there's one specific line that I actually refer to in terms of life lessons, it actually is a line by Maya Angelou, something like, when you see better, you do better. Instead of feeling like you have a problematic personality or a character flaw, it's realizing that it's our ignorance, it's our not understanding, it's our mistaking where happiness is to be found that has us create so much turmoil and suffering often. And so that's a thing I remind myself of.
Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. I just wanted to touch on self compassion, which the great teacher Kristen Neff describes so beautifully, I think, as giving ourselves the same kindness that we would give to a good friend. This self compassion, which for many is actually a strange notion that we are not brought up with. What does it mean for you?
It's an important thing to try to explore because I don't think I've ever taught about self compassion without having somebody raise their hand and say, well, that's just being lazy. And it doesn't mean that at all. But really, we can be merciless and we speak to ourselves in a way we would never speak to a friend, because the goal is not to punish ourselves. The goal is to learn when we've made a mistake and maybe make amends or maybe just move on with lessons learned. I'm going to try not to do that again, you know? In terms of mindfulness techniques, I would say things like, check the tendency we have to globalize instead of that was a mistake, to translate that into I am a terrible person and I always will be. And to look at those kinds of tendencies and realize if I was speaking to a child of mine or a friend of mine, that would not be helpful. Or as one psychologist once said to me, the brain filled with shame cannot learn. Understanding that, I think, is very important.
Yeah. My daughter Sharon is 13 now, and I often think of her as a mirror. So if we're in the kitchen together and I say something to myself like, oh, trust you, or whatever it may be, that's actually probably more unkind than that. I see her and I'm on autocorrect almost as quickly as I can. And it's very interesting because sometimes the mirror of a friend or a child present, we can catch ourselves. And often without that, that voice can often just circulate and go unheard as our internal radio. So that understanding of our thoughts are not us, for me, was radical. I think that's one of the main things that I thought this mindfulness gig, this has got something. And so for me, the practicality of mindfulness is at its core as to how we can extrapolate and use and benefit not only ourselves, but also those around us. In the UK, Sharon, there is a growing discussion about developing healthy relationships with the way that we use our phones, the way we use social media, how we communicate, how we have healthy boundaries, and especially how we do all of that with our children, so that we're not always on the hamster wheel of human doings as opposed to human beings. And I wonder if you have any observations on how mindfulness can help regulate our behavior and remind us to check in on what we're actually doing and where we're placing our attention.
I was once interviewed by a journalist about doom scrolling, where you kind of read and read and read and read and read the same story over and over and over again on your phone until you're overwhelmed and demoralized and depleted. Basic mindfulness teaching for any kind of addictive behavior would begin with notice how something makes you feel. The thing we are reaching for because we think it's elevating or uplifting may just be bringing us down and confusing us. And that's not to say you don't necessarily want to read the news at all, but there's moderation in all things. And there is a certain point where it's too much. You're not learning anything new. It's not even a new angle on things, it's just a new version of the same story. Pay attention to how you feel. Use your body as a kind of mirror for being able to discern those feelings and realize that you can be empowered in making a choice, even though the world may be telling you you need to be on that phone 15 hours a day. Maybe not. And sometimes make an experiment. People, for example, in New York City tell me they miss the days when you would often just strike up a random conversation with somebody. You're sitting next to them on a bus or standing in line at the grocery store, and some very interesting conversations would happen. Now everyone's just on their phone. So maybe you and your friends decide, you know what, for this week, I'm going to not be on my phone in these situations. You may choose not to speak to anybody. It's up to you, but they'll be on their phone anyway. So you may not want to, but just see what it's like. Keep experimenting and pay attention.
Now, Sharon, I wanted to end our conversation with a rather light-hearted confession, which is that I have a mindfulness cupboard which only exists in my imagination. And this cupboard has shelves in it which have ideas, poems, thoughts. On the top shelf, I have a miniature collection of my mindfulness heroes. And on this shelf, you are sat in between Dolly Parton, who I know practices, and John Kabat-Zinn. There are at least 10 of you in there as sources of inspiration to keep me going. So my question is, if you had a similar mindful cupboard, who might be sat on your shelf and why?
This is like a take on a very classical Tibetan practice of a refuge tree who's supporting you, even if you've never met them. Certainly my teachers, and I've had many different teachers, great blessings in my life. And I'll just talk about one who was a woman named Deepa Maurer, who was actually the person who told me to teach when I went to see her in 1974, leaving India for what I was convinced was going to be a very short trip back to the States before I went back to India for the rest of my life. And I went to Calcutta where she was living, and she said to me, "When you go back, you'll be teaching." And I said, "No, I won't." And she said, "Yes, you will." I said, "No, I won't. I mean, it's ridiculous. I can't teach." She is certainly in there, and teachers before and after her who've been just so essential in my own life.
And Sharon, I just wonder if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to share with us to leave us to ponder.
For those of you who are not experienced meditators, it may seem daunting, but it's really not. It's a very natural thing to take up. And those of you who are meditators but find it hard to find the time, that's natural also. And yet it's really not that much. Nobody's saying you have to sit in a pretzel like pose 8 hours a day to get anywhere. It's a heartfelt commitment, but we can do that.
Sharon, thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with me on Mindful Life. I have thoroughly enjoyed listening to your stories and your wisdom, and it's a treat to be able to have you here today. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you.
If you'd like to find out more about Sharon Salzberg, her work, books, meditations, and upcoming events, you can go to sharonsalzberg.com, where you'll find links to her Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media accounts. Thanks for listening to this special episode of Mindful Life.